Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Dark Domain. Now I know a lot of you these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also, like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episode. Right? Let's get comfy and relaxed and Jake had always taken the earlier trains home, finding comfort in the predictability of his evening commute. The familiar rhythm of the train, the hum of the tracks, and the quiet rustle of newspapers provided a sense of closure to the day. But a recent promotion at work changed his routine, forcing him to stay late into the night. With fewer options, Jake found himself boarding the last train home, quiet, nearly empty ride along an old, rarely used rail line. At first glance, the train appeared like any other. The seats were worn, the lighting dim, casting long shadows that danced with the motion of the train. Faint smell of metal and aged fabric lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of rain-soaked streets outside. It was a setting Jake found strangely peaceful, a sanctuary of sorts after the long hours at the office. But as the nights wore on, Jake began to notice something unsettling. Certain passengers were always there, night after night, occupying the same seats, sitting silently, staring straight ahead. Their presence was constant, unchanging, as if they were fixtures of the train itself. There was something odd about them, something that made Jake's skin prickle with unease. They were dressed in clothes that seemed out of place, styles from different eras, mismatched and peculiar. An old man in a tattered suit from the 1920s, a woman in a floral dress reminiscent of the 1940s, a young boy in knee-high socks and a cap from the 1950s. Jake's initial curiosity soon turned to discomfort. The passengers never moved, never spoke, never seemed to notice each other. They simply sat there, eyes fixed on nothing, as if caught in some endless loop of time. Each night, Jake would find himself glancing at them, trying to make sense of their presence. The more he observed, the more the unease grew. It was as if these people were not truly there, as if they were mere shadows of the past, lingering in a place where they no longer belonged. The train's atmosphere began to feel oppressive, the silence too thick, the shadows too deep. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks, once soothing, now seemed to echo with an eerie resonance. Jake felt as though he were intruding on something ancient and secret, something that defied explanation. The thought nagged at him, gnawing away at his sense of reality. The train would pull into each station, the doors would open, and yet the passengers remained seated. No one ever boarded, and no one ever left. It was as if the train existed in its own pocket of time, disconnected from the world outside. Jake's journey home, once a mundane routine, had become a passage through an uncanny, ghostly realm. Each night, as Jake stepped off the train, he would feel a sense of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders. But the unease lingered, a shadow that followed him home, creeping into his thoughts as he lay in bed. Questions haunted him. Who were these people? Why were they always there? And what would happen if he stayed on the train just a little longer? The answers, Jake knew, lay in the darkness of that train, in the silence of those passengers, in the ghostly stillness of a journey that seemed to stretch far beyond the tracks. As the night slipped by, Jake's unease deepened, turning into an obsession that gnawed at him with every ride home. The faces of the passengers had become familiar to him, their eerie stillness a constant presence on the train. Each one seemed to belong to a different era, a different story, yet they never interacted, never exchanged even the briefest of glances. They were like mannequins in a macabre display, frozen in time. There was the elderly woman, her posture rigid, her bony fingers clutching a faded handbag in her lap. She was always dressed in a dark Victorian gown, its lace collar frayed, the fabric worn thin by the passage of years. Her hat, adorned with a dusty veil, obscured her face. But Jake could just make out the deep lines etched into her skin, the lifeless gaze beneath the shadow of the brim. She sat near the window, staring out into the blackness, as if searching for something long lost. Opposite her was a young man, his shoulders squared, expression stern. He wore a soldier's uniform, the kind that Jake recognized from old war photos. Thick wool, brass buttons, and a cap pulled low over his brow. His hands rested on his knees, fingers curled into fists. the knuckles white as if gripping the memory of some distant battlefield. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, unblinking, unseeing, as if the horrors of war had hollowed him out, leaving only a shell behind. Then there was the little girl, always seated a few rows down from Jake. Her hair was neatly tied with a ribbon, her dress, a simple, old-fashioned frock that might have once been cheerful, was now faded and threadbare. She clutched a ragged doll to her chest, toy's face cracked and stained, one glass eye missing. The girl's small frame seemed almost swallowed by the vastness of the seat, and yet she sat with an unsettling stillness, her wide eyes staring blankly at the floor, as if she were listening to some distant, mournful lullaby. Jake's curiosity became a compulsion, a need to understand the enigma of these silent passengers. He tried to engage with them, speaking softly at first, then louder, but his words seemed to dissolve into the stale air, unheard and unheeded. He waved a hand in front of their faces. There was no response, not even a flicker of recognition. It was as if they existed in a separate reality, a dimension just out of reach. A sense of isolation was suffocating. Jake could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on him like a cold, invisible hand. The train, once a simple means of transport, had become a vessel of dread, a journey into the unknown. Each night, the questions grew louder in his mind. Were these passengers real? Were they ghosts, echoes of lives long past, doomed to ride the train for eternity? Or was Jake losing his grip on reality, his sanity unraveling with every passing mile? The train's relentless rhythm, once comforting, now felt like the ticking of a clock counting down to some inevitable, terrifying revelation. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong, that the passengers were not just figures from the past, but harbingers of something far darker, something that lurked just beyond the edge of understanding. And so each night, as the train rolled into his stop, Jake would hesitate before stepping off, his heart pounding, his mind racing with dread and fascination. The temptation to stay on, to follow the train to its final destination, grew stronger with each passing ride. But the fear of what lay beyond that final stop kept him grounded, tethered to the fragile safety of the known world. Yet deep down, Jake knew that the mystery of the unchanging passengers would not be easily dismissed. There was a darkness here, an ancient secret that clung to the train like a shroud. And Jake was already too far gone to turn back. One night, as the train trundled along its familiar route, Jake found himself staring vacantly out the window. The city lights blurred into streaks of yellow and white, giving way to the shadowy outskirts where the train often felt most isolated. The landscape outside was familiar, but the darkness held an oppressive weight. It seemed to press against the glass, a reminder of how far removed the train was from the bustling world above. The train began to enter a tunnel, the world outside swallowed by inky blackness. The lights inside the train flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the empty seats. Jake's reflection in the window appeared distorted, as if the glass were a portal to a twisted version of reality. As the train plunged deeper into the tunnel, Jake glanced at the window, his own weary face mirrored back at him. And then, something else. His breath caught in his throat as the reflection shifted. The passengers, who had been sitting in their usual stillness, began to change. Their serene expressions melted away, placed by something far more sinister. Jake's eyes widened in horror as he saw the elderly woman's face turn gaunt, her skin clinging to her skull like parchment, eyes sinking into hollow, lifeless sockets. The lace collar of her dress was torn, revealing dark stains that spread across the fabric like old blood. The young soldier's uniform was now shredded, brass buttons tarnished and smeared with grime. His face, once stern and composed, was twisted into a mask of agony, his mouth open in a silent scream. His hands, once resting on his knees, were now covered in dark, clotted blood, as if he had been trying to stem a wound that had long since claimed his life. The little girl, once clutching her doll, now held it limply. Toy's face cracked and twisted, its one remaining eye hanging by a thread. The girl's hair was matted, her eyes wide and vacant, her dress tattered and soaked in what looked like mud and blood. Her expression was one of abject terror, as though she had seen something so horrifying that it had frozen her in that moment of fear forever. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he blinked rapidly. hoping to clear the horrifying vision from his mind. But each time his eyes opened, the ghastly images remained, more vivid and terrifying than before. He could feel the bile rising in his throat, his pulse racing as he struggled to tear his gaze away from the window. It was as if the reflections had come alive, revealing the true nature of the passengers who had haunted his night. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision disappeared. The train emerged from the tunnel, the lights steadied, and the passengers were once again serene and silent, their clothes pristine, their faces calm. The train's interior was unchanged, the air heavy with the same oppressive stillness that had become all too familiar. Jake sat back, his breath ragged, his mind racing to make sense of what he had just seen. Was it a trick of the light? Figment of his imagination, born from the exhaustion and stress of his long workdays? Or had he just glimpsed the true nature of these mysterious passengers? Ghosts, perhaps, or something even more sinister, trapped in a loop of endless torment. The image of their hollow eyes and blood-stained clothes lingered in Jake's mind, etching itself into his memory with a vividness that refused to fade. He began to question his sanity, wondering if the train itself was warping his perception, drawing him deeper into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Every time the train approached another tunnel, Jake would brace himself, dreading what he might see next. The once peaceful journey home had become a descent into madness, each night a step closer to the horrifying truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of the ordinary. Determined to unravel the mystery of the unsettling visions he had experienced, Jake immersed himself in researching the history of the rail line. What began as a casual curiosity soon turned into an obsession, as he combed through old newspapers, archival records, and forgotten local lore. Each piece of information he uncovered felt like a clue, a fragment of a puzzle that grew more terrifying with each discovered. One night, while poring over a dusty collection of newspaper clippings at the local library, Jake found what he was looking for. The headline, yellowed with age, read, "Tragic train derailment claims dozens of lives. Bodies never recovered." His heart raced as he read the article, the words blurring together as the chilling details came into focus. Decades ago, on a cold, foggy night, a late-night train had derailed on the very line that Jake now rode home every evening. The accident occurred in a remote area where the tracks curved sharply around a steep ravine. The train had been traveling at high speed when it suddenly went off the rails, the metal screeching as the cars tumbled down into the abyss below. The impact was catastrophic. The wreckage twisted and mangled beyond recognition. Rescue efforts were hindered by the treacherous terrain and the thick fog that clung to the landscape like a shroud. Despite their best efforts, the bodies of the passengers were never recovered. The ravine was deep and dangerous, and as days turned into weeks, the search was eventually called off. The families of the victims were left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. Their loved ones' final resting place, a mystery that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The victims, Jake read, were from all walks of life, men and women, young and old, rich and poor. Some were returning home after a long day of work, others were travelers passing through, and a few were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their lives, so varied and full of promise, were cut short in an instant, their final moments consumed by terror and despair. As he continued reading, Jake stumbled upon an unsettling piece of local folklore. According to the legend, the souls of the victims were said to be trapped between worlds, unable to move on because their bodies had never been found. They were doomed to wander the earth, reliving their final moments over and over, until someone could uncover the truth and bring them peace. The thought sent a chill down Jake's spine. Could it be that the passengers he saw every night were the restless spirits of those lost souls? Was the train he boarded each night a spectral echo of that doomed journey, forever repeating its tragic course? The more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. The eerie silence of the passengers, their outdated clothing, the horrific vision he had glimpsed in the tunnel. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The train was not just a means of transport. It was a vessel of the dead, carrying the ghosts of those who had perished in that terrible accident. Their spirits, bound to the train, were unable to find peace, trapped in an eternal loop of suffering. And Jake, whether by fate or chance, had become a part of their journey, drawn into the nightmare that played out night after night. The weight of this knowledge pressed heavily on Jake's mind, the fear and sadness of the lost souls seeping into his thoughts. Could no longer dismiss his experiences as mere imagination. The train had become a haunted place, a reminder of lives tragically cut short and stories left unfinished. What could he do? How could he help these tormented spirits find the closure they so desperately needed? Jake knew that his journey on the last train had only just begun, and the answers he sought would come at a price. The night was colder than usual as Jake boarded the train, his breath fogging the air as he stepped onto the platform. The familiar creak of the old train greeted him. Tonight, something felt different. An unsettling heaviness in the air that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. As the doors hissed shut behind him, sealing him into the dimly lit car, Jake's eyes were drawn to a figure he hadn't seen before. Standing near the entrance, with an air of authority that set him apart from the spectral passengers, was a stern-looking conductor. His uniform, though old-fashioned, was crisp and well-kept, a sharp contrast to the tattered clothing of the other passengers. His face was weathered, his eyes hard and piercing, as if they had seen more than they cared to remember. But it was the conductor's awareness that struck Jake the most. This man seemed different, as if he were fully conscious of the world around him, unlike the ghostly figures who rode the train in silent oblivion. As Jake took his usual seat, he could feel the conductor's gaze upon him, a heavy weight that made his skin prickle with unease. The man approached with slow, deliberate steps, the sound of his polished boots echoing through the near-empty car. When he stopped beside Jake, the tension in the air grew thick, silence almost suffocating. "You shouldn't be here," the conductor said, his voice low and filled with an ominous certainty. There was no warmth in his tone, only a cold finality that sent a chill down Jake's spine. Jake felt his heart hammering in his chest, the warning striking him with the force of a physical blow. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask the conductor what he meant, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the gravity of the man's statement. "This train isn't for the living," the conductor continued, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jake's face. The implication of his words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and for a moment, Jake felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. The realization hit him with terrifying clarity. He had been riding a train that did not belong to his world, a spectral journey meant for those who were no longer among the living. Desperation clawed at Jake's thoughts. He had so many questions, so many things he needed to understand, but before he could form the words, the conductor turned away. With a measured, almost mechanical grace, the man walked down the aisle, his figure fading into the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the dim light. "Wait," Jake finally managed to call out, his voice shaky and tinged with panic. But the conductor didn't stop. His form seemed to dissolve into the darkness, merging with the shadows until he was gone, leaving Jake alone with the echo of his ominous warning. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on Jake from all sides. He could feel the weight of the conductor's words settling into his bones, a chilling reminder that he was trespassing in a place where he did not belong. The thought of what might happen if he continued this journey filled him with a dread that was almost unbearable. Yet, despite the fear gnawing at him, Jake's curiosity remained, stronger than ever. He had come too far to turn back now, too invested in the mystery of the train and its passengers. The conductor's warning only served to deepen his resolve. There was something here, something dark and dangerous, but also something that needed to be understood. Jake knew that he was risking more than just his sanity by continuing his investigation. The line between the living and the dead had been blurred, and each night he boarded the train, he felt himself slipping further into a world that defied all logic and reason. But he couldn't stop now. Not when the truth was so close, just beyond the veil of shadows that cloaked the train in darkness. With a deep breath, Jake resolved to see this through, no matter the cost. The conductor's warning echoed in his mind, but it only served to fuel his determination. He would uncover the secrets of the train, even if it meant facing whatever horrors lay in wait on the other side. The nights grew longer and colder as Jake's journey on the last train continued. The once familiar routine had become a descent into the unknown, each ride bringing with it a new layer of dread. But nothing could have prepared Jake for the night he realized the train was no longer stopping at its usual stations. First, the changes were subtle. The train would glide past a station where it normally stopped, platform dark and deserted, as if it had been abandoned for years. Jake dismissed it as a delay or a detour, something explainable. But as the train barreled through the night, the world outside the windows began to shift, becoming more alien and unsettling with each passing mile. The landscapes outside the train grew more desolate with every ride. Instead of the familiar urban sprawl or suburban neighborhoods, Jake found himself staring at scenes that seemed ripped from another time, or perhaps another reality altogether. The train passed through abandoned towns, their buildings crumbling and overgrown with vines, as if nature had reclaimed them long ago. The once paved streets were now cracked and broken, covered in layers of dust and debris that spoke of years of neglect. As the train sped on, the towns gave way to dense, overgrown forests, their trees twisted and gnarled, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, leaving the landscape bathed in an unnatural darkness, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Jake could almost feel the weight of the forest pressing against the windows, the branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, eager to pull him into their depths. On another night, the train rolled through vast, fog-covered fields, the mist swirling around like ghostly figures dancing in the night. The fields stretched out as far as the eye could see, their boundaries lost in the thick, impenetrable fog. There were no signs of life, no lights, no movement, only the oppressive silence that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. The stillness was suffocating, the atmosphere charged with a tension that made Jake's skin crawl. The sense of dread that had been gnawing at Jake's mind now grew into a palpable fear. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, cold, heavy knot that tightened with every mile. The train was no longer just a means of transportation. It had become a vehicle for something far more sinister, a journey into a world where the rules of reality no longer applied. Passengers, as always, remained silent and motionless, their expressions blank and vacant. They seemed utterly oblivious to the changes in the scenery, as if the vanishing stops and eerie landscapes were as familiar to them as the daily commute once was to Jake. Their presence, once merely unsettling, now felt ominous, as if they were specters from a forgotten past, guiding him toward a fate he couldn't escape. Jake began to wonder if the train was pulling him into the same fate as the other passengers. Was he destined to become one of them, trapped in this nightmarish loop, forever riding a train that had long since departed from the world of the living? The thought filled him with a terror so profound that he could barely breathe. Every night as he boarded the train, he felt a part of himself slipping away, lost to the darkness that had swallowed the rail line whole. He knew he was being taken somewhere far from the life he once knew, and perhaps even further from the life he still clung to. The train had become a bridge between worlds, and with each passing night, Jake feared that he was crossing a point of no return. The familiar world he had always known was slipping away, replaced by a nightmarish landscape that defied explanation, leaving him stranded in a realm where time and reality twisted and bled together. The vanishing stops were more than just a deviation from the route. They were a sign, a warning that the train was no longer bound by the constraints of the living world. Jake was being led into the unknown, and the further the train took him, the more he feared he would never find his way back. The night had an oppressive stillness to it. As Jake boarded the last train, his nerves frayed from the countless nights spent unraveling the mystery of this haunted journey. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Tension so thick it was almost tangible, as if the very fabric of reality was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The train rattled along its usual path, the scenery outside a blur of dark, twisted landscapes. Jake could feel a cold sweat forming on his brow, the chill of the night seeping into his bones. His eyes flicked nervously around the car, noting the familiar, spectral passengers seated in their usual spots, their expressions as vacant as ever. But tonight, there was an undeniable weight in their presence, as if they were waiting for something too. Without warning, the train lurched to a sudden halt. The screeching of the brakes echoed through the empty car, reverberating off the metal walls with a bone-chilling wail. Jake was thrown forward, catching himself on the edge of his seat as the lights overhead flickered, plunging the car into a momentary darkness. The sudden stop was jarring, a violent break in the monotonous rhythm that had defined these nocturnal rides. When the lights sputtered back to life, the car was bathed in a sickly, pale glow. Jake's breath came out in short, visible puffs, the temperature having dropped drastically in an instant. The air was thick with an otherworldly cold, chill that seemed to cut straight to the soul. He glanced out the window, but there was nothing to see, just an endless stretch of darkness, devoid of any landmarks or signs of life. It was as if the train had stopped in the middle of nowhere, lost in a void that existed outside the realm of time and space. As Jake's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed something that sent a shiver down his spine. Passengers, who had always remained eerily still and silent, were now all staring directly at him. Their gazes were heavy with sorrow, their eyes hollow and filled with a deep, unspoken grief. It was a look of resignation, of acceptance of a fate that could not be undone. For the first time, Jake felt the full weight of their existence, their presence no longer just a haunting curiosity, but a terrifying reality. Before he could react, the conductor appeared at the far end of the car. His figure seemed to materialize from the shadows, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that made Jake's blood run cold. The conductor's face was even paler than before, almost translucent, the ghostly contours of his features barely visible beneath the dim light. His eyes were dark, deep pools of nothingness that seemed to swallow all light, reflecting only the despair of countless lost souls. The conductor approached Jake, his footsteps echoing ominously in the silence. When he spoke, his voice was a low whisper, barely more than a breath, yet it carried the weight of finality. "You've seen too much," he intoned, his words laced with an otherworldly authority. There was no anger in his tone, only a cold, detached certainty that left no room for doubt. Jake felt his heart pounding in his chest, the gravity of the situation crashing down on him with the force of a tidal wave. He had been searching for answers, for the truth behind the eerie passengers and the ghostly train, but now that he had found it, realization was more than he could bear. The train was a vessel, a conduit for lost souls trapped between worlds, eternally bound to the last journey they would ever take. And now, Jake was faced with a choice that would determine his fate for eternity. The conductor's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Now you must choose. Leave this train and never return, or stay and become one of us." The words hung in the air, thick with menace and inevitability. Jake's mind raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to escape this nightmare before it was too late. But as he looked into the conductor's empty eyes, he knew that the choice was not as simple as it seemed. This was no mere threat, it was a declaration of his fate. If he didn't leave now, he would be trapped in this eternal loop, a ghostly passenger on a train that never reached its destination. Jake's legs trembled as he stood, his body feeling as though it was moving through thick molasses. The sorrowful gazes of the passengers bore into him, their silent pleas almost tangible in the cold air. He took a step toward the door, his heart pounding in his ears. Every fiber of his being urged him to run, to escape the clutches of this cursed train before it claimed him as its own. But as he reached the door, his hand hovering over the handle, he hesitated. The conductor's words echoed in his mind, and the reality of the choice before him became starkly clear. Leaving would mean returning to the world of the living, but it would also mean turning his back on the truth he had sought for so long. Staying meant an eternity of shadowy existence, but it also meant understanding the mysteries that had consumed him. With a deep breath, Jake made his decision, knowing that whatever choice he made, there would be no turning back. The moment Jake made his decision, a wave of panic surged through him. cold, oppressive atmosphere of the train car seemed to tighten around him, suffocating him in its ghostly embrace. Without another thought, he bolted toward the nearest door, his heart racing, his mind filled with a singular, desperate need to escape. But the door refused to budge. Jake's fingers scrabbled at the handle, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pulled with all his strength. The metal was cold and unyielding, as if the train itself had sealed him in, determined to make him one of its eternal passengers. Behind him, he heard the soft rustling of fabric as the ghostly passengers began to rise from their seats. Their once vacant eyes now locked onto him with a terrifying intensity. Their forms shimmered in the dim light, their ghostly figures moving toward him with a slow, deliberate purpose. Desperation gripped Jake like a vice. He pounded on the door with both fists, the metal reverberating under the force of his blows, but it remained stubbornly closed. Cold air in the car grew even more frigid, his breath visible in the form of desperate, misty plumes. The closer the ghostly passengers drew, the more tangible their presence became, the air around them growing thick with an icy dread. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but the train seemed to stretch on endlessly in both directions, an infinite corridor of despair. The conductor was nowhere to be seen, leaving Jake alone with the relentless approach of the spectral figures. The weight of their sorrow was almost unbearable, pressing down on him from all sides, filling his mind with thoughts of resignation, of surrender. But Jake wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. In a final desperate act, he slammed his shoulder against the door with all his might, his body trembling with the force of his fear and determination. Just as the first of the ghostly passengers reached out toward him, their cold, ethereal hands inches from his skin, the door suddenly gave way. The sound of its release was like a crack of thunder, shattering the suffocating silence that had gripped the car. Jake stumbled out onto the tracks, cold night air hitting him like a wave of ice. The sudden change in temperature was shocking, jolting him back to reality as he fell to his knees on the hard, uneven ground. He gasped for breath, his lungs burning from the effort, his heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might burst from his chest. He looked up, his vision blurred with tears and sweat, and found himself standing in an old, abandoned station. The platform was cracked and overgrown with weeds, the once bright signs faded and unreadable. The air was thick with mist, swirling around him in ghostly tendrils, obscuring the edges of the platform and the tracks beyond. Behind him, the train loomed in the mist, its once imposing presence now fading into a shadowy outline. The ghostly passengers stood at the door, their sorrowful eyes still fixed on Jake. They made no move to follow him. Instead, they remained on the train, their forms slowly dissolving into the mist as the train itself began to disappear. The conductor appeared one last time, his figure barely visible through the thick fog. He didn't speak, but Jake could feel the weight of his gaze, silent acknowledgement of the choice that had been made. The train, now almost completely engulfed by the mist, began to pull away from the platform, its wheels creaking and groaning as it vanished into the darkness, taking with it the lost souls it carried. Jake was left standing alone in the abandoned station, cold night air biting at his skin, the silence of the night settling heavily around him. He had escaped, but the horror of what he had witnessed, the ghostly passengers, the conductor's warning, the train that was not meant for the living, would haunt him forever. The image of those sorrowful eyes, filled with an eternal grief, would stay with him for the rest of his days, constant reminder of the night he rode the last train. Jake never set foot on the last train again. The mere thought of it sent shivers down his spine, the memory of that night etched deeply into his mind. The haunting experience had shaken him to his core, leaving him with a sense of unease that he couldn't seem to shake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hollow, sorrowful faces of the ghostly passengers, their silent stares a constant reminder of the terror he had narrowly escaped. Returning to his normal life proved to be an impossible task. The familiar routine of work and home offered little comfort, as the memories of that fateful night clung to him like a dark shadow. Even the most mundane activities were tainted by the lingering fear that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. The world had lost its normalcy, and in its place, a pervasive dread had taken root. Every time Jake heard the distant sound of a train whistle, his heart would race, his body seized by an involuntary panic. Didn't matter if he was at work, at home, or walking down the street, the shrill cry of the whistle would transport him back to that night on the ghostly train. The sensation was visceral, as if the air around him grew colder, the shadows darker, and the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him. He would find himself paralyzed by fear, his mind racing with the horrors he had witnessed, the train's relentless presence still haunting his thoughts. Jake knew he couldn't keep this to himself forever. The burden of the experience was too heavy to bear alone. But every time he thought about sharing his story, a wave of doubt washed over him. Who would believe such a tale? The story seemed too fantastical, too terrifying to be real. It was the kind of thing you read about in ghost stories or saw in horror films, not something that actually happened to ordinary people. How could he expect anyone to take him seriously? He tried to tell himself that it had all been a bad dream, a figment of his imagination conjured by stress and fatigue. But deep down, he knew the truth. Cold, empty eyes of the passengers, the conductor's ominous warning, eerie stop in the middle of nowhere. It had all been too real, too vivid to dismiss as mere fantasy. The encounter had left a mark on him, an invisible scar that would never fully heal. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed, Jake would stare up at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of that night over and over again. Sleep eluded him, as his thoughts twisted and turned, haunted by the images of the ghostly figures who had shared that train ride with him. The darkness of his room felt suffocating, and the silence was broken only by the faint echoes of the past, a distant memory that refused to fade. In his isolation, Jake became increasingly paranoid, jumping at shadows and flinching at every unexpected noise. The world felt like a fragile facade, hiding darker truths that only he had glimpsed. He began avoiding conversations about trains or anything remotely related to his experience, fearing that any mention of it would somehow draw him back into that nightmare. He kept his story locked away, a secret too dangerous to share, too horrifying to forget. Yet, despite his best efforts to move on, Jake couldn't escape the feeling that the train wasn't finished with him. It was as if it had left a piece of itself behind, lodged deep within his soul. A reminder that some doors once opened could never be fully closed. The fear of what might happen if he ever let his guard down kept him on edge, unable to fully relax, unable to forget. Jake had escaped the train, but the horror of that night would follow him forever. Months had passed since that harrowing night, and Jake had done everything he could to bury the memory deep within the recesses of his mind. He had thrown himself into his work, taken up new hobbies, and surrounded himself with friends and family, all in an effort to forget. But despite his best efforts, the experience lingered, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to pounce the moment he let his guard down. Life had regained a semblance of normalcy. Yet there were still moments when Jake would catch himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the train's ghostly lights cutting through the night. He avoided the old rail line as much as possible, taking longer routes home to ensure he never had to walk near the station. But no matter how far he strayed from the path, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, one night, that moment came. Jake was walking home, his mind preoccupied with the trivialities of the day, when he heard it, a distant, mournful sound that sent a shiver down his spine. The whistle of a train. He froze in his tracks, his heart beginning to race as the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a sound he had hoped never to hear again, one that he had prayed was confined to the past. But as the familiar clattering of wheels on tracks echoed through the night, he knew the truth. The last train was coming. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he slowly turned around. There, in the distance, he saw it. The last train, dim lights flickering as it approached the station, moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if it had all the time in the world. The air around Jake grew colder, the once familiar surroundings taking on an eerie, otherworldly quality. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced in the corners of his vision. The train pulled into the station, its brakes screeching in protest as it came to a halt. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing the dark, empty interior. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get as far away as possible. But he couldn't move, his feet rooted to the spot as if held in place by some unseen force. Then he saw him, conductor. He stood on the platform just as he had on that fateful night. His eyes locked onto Jake's with an intensity that sent a wave of dread crashing over him. Conductor's face was even paler than before, his features gaunt, his eyes hollow and filled with an unfathomable darkness. The same darkness that Jake had seen in the eyes of the ghostly passengers. "It's time," Conductor said, his voice echoing through the empty station. The words were spoken softly, almost gently, but they carried a weight that made Jake's blood run cold. The sound of the conductor's voice seemed to reverberate through the air, distorting reality itself. It was as if the world around Jake was being pulled into the train's orbit, its dark influence spreading like a poison. Panic surged through Jake as the full realization of what was happening hit him. The train had come back for him. He had thought he could escape, that he had been given a choice, but now he understood the truth. The choice had never been his to make. The last train had claimed him that night. No matter how far he ran, it would always find him. The conductor stepped back, his gaze never leaving Jake's. The door to the train remained open, a silent invitation to board. But it was more than that. It was a command, an inevitability that Jake could no longer resist. The air around him seemed to press in on all sides, pushing him toward the train, his body moving of its own accord. With each step Jake took, the world around him seemed to fade, the station, the night, the very fabric of reality itself being swallowed by the darkness of the train. Closer he got, the more distant everything else became. As if he were crossing a threshold from one world into another. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he reached the train's door. Paused, one last desperate flicker of resistance burning within him, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold, unyielding certainty that there was no other path. The train would not be denied. With a final, resigned breath, Jake stepped onto the train. The doors slid shut behind him with a hiss, sealing his fate. The conductor gave him a brief nod, a gesture that seemed almost sympathetic before turning and walking down the aisle. The train began to move, the station slowly disappearing into the darkness outside. Jake took a seat, his body trembling as the reality of his situation settled in. The train was silent, the only sound the soft clatter of wheels on tracks as it carried him into the unknown. The passengers were there, seated in their usual places, their eyes staring blankly ahead. But this time, Jake didn't feel like an outsider among them. He knew that soon he would be one of them, trapped in the eternal loop of the last train. As the train plunged into the night, Jake felt the last remnants of his former life slip away. He was no longer Jake, no longer a man with a past or a future. He was just another passenger on the last train, a lost soul bound to the rails, forever traveling through the darkness.